Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to get into all sorts of issues today. So, first of all, I'm just going to have a couple of real quick comments about this issue of the vaccine and the virus for a number of reasons, because some of that is moving along. Perhaps you have seen some of the debate right now about giving the vaccine to children, and that one is in process. But we do have a decision that has come down from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which updated their guidelines yesterday that said that some individuals who have received either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine will be able to get a fourth shot. Raises, of course, all sorts of questions that go all the way back to conversations we had with one of the doctors in the studio here and some others about whether or not these would have a level of durability. Does the immunity, either that comes from natural immunity or from artificial immunity from these various vaccines, how long does that last? And you may know that already what is being called the third COVID-19 vaccine shot is now being called the additional shot. This new fourth one would then be called a booster. I think somebody's playing with words a little bit, but wherever you come down on this issue, it does raise some very significant questions, because the assumption was made that the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine would at least last 6 months. And, of course, some people that more than 6 months ago got those vaccines got their third particular dose. Been some real debates about whether or not you, for example, could mix or match. Seems like that is the case. But the argument being now used right now is that for what are defined as immunocompromised people, and there is a definition there in the CDC guidelines of what that would be, those individuals could indeed get a fourth dose, which is considered a booster. So just thought I'd bring you up to date there. Where we go on the vaccine for the children, we'll probably cover on Friday, although most of the decision won't be made till next week. So we'll see what we can cover there. But I thought just before we take a break and get into some other topics, I thought I would mention that there are some reports now beginning to come in that are asking a very important question. Which state in the United States has the lowest COVID-19 rate? And you might think, well, I don't know, it might be California, because it has some of the most strict mask and vaccine requirements. No, it's not California. You might think it's Vermont, because after all, you have probably more individuals there that have been inoculated or vaccinated, depending on which word you want to use, than as percentage than anyone else in the country. But no, the state with the fewest daily COVID cases per capita is Florida. Now, you can immediately recognize that Florida was on the crosshairs of a lot of the more liberal commentators, as well as some of the governors in blue states, to say that this is immoral and that this is reason enough for us to maybe even bring criminal charges against Governor Ron DeSantis. And so what I want to do real quickly before we take a break is, first of all, acknowledge that anytime you look for a pattern, you can't find it. And the first thing I will say to some some maybe conservatives or anti-mandate type of people is, you don't need to make the same mistake that some of the critics were making before. And that is, they were actually saying that people are going to die in record numbers in the Sunshine State. That shows that mask mandates are important. This shows that lockdowns are important, and on and on and on and on. Now you can't turn it around, and should not turn it around, for example, and say, well, that shows that lockdowns, masks, and everything have no impact at all. Because as I've tried to communicate on this program, and I have a commentary which even has the graph, if you go and list all 50 states, you will notice that you have a hodgepodge. I mean, if indeed mask mandates, lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations, all of the rest were really important, which tend to be pushed more technically in the blue states, then you would expect that their particular risk factor, that is the number of new cases per capita, would be on the top of the chart, and the red states, which had fewer mandates, would be lower on the chart. And if you look at that chart, and we've made it available, and you can do a search on pointofview.net, what you get is a mixture. Just about the time you start seeing a little bit of a trend, you don't see a trend. And so, again, you have to understand that this latest article coming out saying during the past 2 months, the Florida's daily average actually plummeted by more than 90%. But that's roughly half of California's current COVID rate and less than a quarter of Vermont's. By the way, I might say that Hawaii actually is the only other state in single digits, that is single digits per so many 100,000. So again, the point they're saying is, okay, don't congratulate Florida, because, who knows, it could turn around tomorrow. And don't make the same mistake that was made before, in which there was a real biased attempt to say that what was happening in Florida actually was killing people, and what was happening in New York was actually the best kind of policy. We now know a little bit more about Governor Andrew Cuomo and how some of those numbers were fudged. And, of course, there have been some people alleging that in some of these states, included Florida, some of these numbers have been manipulated a little bit. But again, pretty much can get a pretty accurate number when it comes to social statistics. I'll take these over a lot of the others we have to deal with. And it's just a good illustration that we really can't come up with a good answer. And if anything, maybe what this does show is sooner or later, people are going to get the virus. Sometimes people have said getting the virus is kind of like Russian roulette, which I think is a little bit gruesome. But imagine Russian roulette with, instead of having bullets in the chamber, you have maybe some kind of ink blot or something of that nature in the chamber, so people aren't getting killed. But you can imagine that if you play Russian roulette, you put in one of these chambers, maybe an ink bullet, if you will, but not a real bullet, and you spin it, and then you pull the trigger. If there's one in there, your chances are 1 in 6. If there's 2 in there, it's 1 in 3. Now, the bottom line is, you could say that in some of these states which have had very few mandates, it's kind of like putting a chamber in there, like a paintball chamber in there that has 2. And so the chances are you're going to, when you pull the trigger a couple of times, get ink all over you. However, if you pull the trigger long enough, it doesn't matter whether you have 1 paintball vial in there or 2, eventually you're going to get ink on you. And I think that's probably a good analogy of what's happening. Some of those individuals that early on were actually getting the virus and being admitted to hospitals in places where there were fewer mandates and lockdowns, eventually made the numbers look higher. But over time, even when you have the mandates and lockdowns, eventually the virus made their way to individuals as well. And so it's an interesting set of circumstances, but nevertheless, nobody would have predicted just a few weeks ago that the state with the fewest daily COVID cases per capita would be Florida, but at least that's news today in the media. We come back, though, we're going to move away from some of the issues of the vaccine and the virus and all the rest, because we have some interesting things being proposed right now in Congress that could affect your finances and your taxes. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One question I'm frequently asked is, why isn't the government prosecuting voter fraud? My quick answer is that the state and local governments are charging people with voter fraud, but often the media isn't reporting it. News outlets may not think it's an important story, or they may fear that reporting the prosecutions would stimulate more questions about the security of our vote. Not reporting investigations into voter fraud make it easier for critics of voter integrity laws to maintain that these legislative revisions are merely trying to find a solution for a non-existent problem. Just in the last week, I had 3 different articles land in my inbox that demonstrate that election fraud prosecution is taking place right now. In Michigan, 3 women were charged with crimes related to voter fraud. One woman, for example, stole a stack of absentee voter applications meant for nursing home residents, filled them out, and forged the residents' signatures. In Georgia, 2 workers in Fulton County lost their jobs due to accusations of voter fraud, which led to a public statement from the Georgia Secretary of State about such embarrassing revelations. A former judge of elections was charged in the voter fraud scheme in Philadelphia from 2015 to 2019. This included cash payments, along with supporting family, friends, and allies for elective office. Even of greater importance was the statement by prosecutors that fraud occurred at every level of government, from municipal to state to federal. Most of these stories always carry the disclaimer that finding fraud does not prove that there was widespread voter fraud. But that isn't the point. The problem isn't widespread fraud, but targeted voter fraud that can occur in certain cities and precincts. We need laws that make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about what's going on in Capitol Hill. First of all, let me just mention that last week we featured, and I didn't really mention it this week, but it's worth at least talking about the fact that if you want to express your opinion to your member of Congress about this piece of legislation called Build Back Better, then we have still an opportunity for you to take action. And if you go to our website, pointofview.net, that middle column gives you that opportunity. And I have seen that quite a number of you apparently have checked out that and let your representative know, but we haven't really talked about the fact that this piece of legislation is in a bit of trouble. And because it is in a bit of trouble, there are some really good reasons why you should contact your member of Congress. And in a minute, I'm going to give you another talking point that didn't exist until just recently, and it shows the level of desperation that is taking place. So first of all, let me just mention, if you haven't taken the time to let your representative know about the spending of $3.5 trillion, which now they think they've trimmed it down to $2 trillion. What's a few trillion dollars amongst friends? But okay, nevertheless, if you want to express your opinion, we do have that opportunity for you to do so. But even if you have, the latest piece that is part of trying to pay for this is even greater concern. So let me try to talk you through this. And sometimes when you talk about economics, economics, it's easy for your eyes to glaze over. But we're talking about your money. We're talking about your taxes and why I hope you'll pay attention for just a minute. First of all, the way they wanted to pay for this was to raise corporate income tax rates and, of course, individual tax rates. Now, we've been promised that only those people who make more than $400,000 a year will be taxed. And, of course, you know better than that. At least I hope you do. But then the latest proposal then, because those particular issues were basically vetoed by the Arizona Senator, Kirsten Sinema, then there has been a scrambling to try to find some other ways to pay for this. Now, one that was on the table already, which we've talked about before, and reason enough, I think, for you to express your concern to your member of Congress, is that we were told that the IRS was going to be given the responsibility of having each one of the banks, and so thus every bank or savings and loan or credit union would have to report every transaction that you engaged in that was more than $600, or if you had $600 in the bank. That caused a little bit of outcry, as you might imagine. So, again, some of the Senate Democrats said, okay, this is just too controversial. Rather than $600 per transaction, we would now have the IRS mandate that banks report various transactions that are at least $10,000. Now, since most people spend more than $10,000 a year, most do, and very few don't, that might actually lower at least one concern about privacy concerns, because now the IRS is not looking into each discrete transaction, but it still means that the IRS is going to have the banks report everything that has probably happened in your bank account. So that's reason enough to be concerned. And so if you haven't taken the time to express your concern about that particular item, which, by the way, the $600 is still in the bill we're talking about, but the Senate Democrats are talking about $10,000 a year. Once that passes, if it passes, it goes to conference committee, and, we can do a coin flip to see which one ends up in the ultimate law. So you can see that's reason enough to take action, and our take action item today on the Build Back Better Act is one for you to take some action on. But that doesn't bring in enough money. Yes, we might catch a tax cheat here or there. There may be some other income that has been in one way or another sheltered. It might be a way to catch some people that are maybe doing money laundering. But as I mentioned yesterday, and I guess I was about 24 hours or 48 hours too ahead, because now this is the lead article even in the Drudge Report, you have now the argument that we need to come up with a wealth tax. Now, the first part about this is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, who used to be the head of the Federal Reserve, actually, when she went in front of the television cameras the first time, and this is our first article, so you can read it in its entirety, about the IRS investigating into your bank account, didn't really go very well. So now the latest one was for her to go in front again of some of the talking head programs and try to sell this idea. And the idea is simply this: we're going to put a wealth tax, although she admitted, or actually tried to argue, I should be a better way to say it, that this is not a wealth tax. Didn't work very well because Nancy Pelosi then called it a wealth tax. Don't you know that Janet Yellen probably would like to shake Nancy Pelosi for letting that cat out of the bag? But nevertheless, it's a tax on what's called unrealized capital gains. This is slightly complex, but not that complex, because what it simply says is that if your particular stock that you hold, the house that you own, or whatever that might have appreciated, you have to pay taxes even before you sell it. Now, we've always assumed that, let's say you buy stock for $100, you eventually sell it for $200. Well, then you made capital gains of $100, and then when you sell it, matter of fact, you usually get a form that tells you then that you will have to pay capital gains on that $100 profit. You with me on that? I think most people do. And so the argument that they're making right now is we're only going to have this go to the uber rich. And as I pointed out yesterday, let's go back to 1913, the 16th Amendment, which at the time we were assured was only going to cover the very wealthy, and it was only going to have a small percentage. Matter of fact, I think the highest rate there was 7%. It was like 1% tax rate to 7%, which was the marginal tax rate. But it both expanded and increased. It expanded in that all of a sudden it wasn't going to be taxing just the wealthy. Did you pay taxes last year? Yes, you did. If you didn't, well, great for you, but a lot of people did, and more people have been, of course, paying taxes because that expanded dramatically since 1913, and the rates went up from 7% for the top marginal rate to, at the end of World War II, it was up 90-something%, eventually brought down a little bit. So you recognize that whenever they start with the wealthy, that's how they justify, but then they come after you. But then there are all sorts of real problems with this. And again, if you would like to know a little bit more, I would encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, and we call this one Capital Gains Tax Grab. And in this, I think it uses a good example of the disaster this would be, even if you think it should be done. And the writer here suggests, imagine if you had decided to buy stock for the movie theater chain AMC. And at the start of 2020, well, you'd buy that because you say, well, movie theaters are going to do very well. And then we had the pandemic and nobody went to the movie theater. So let's imagine that you bought, just for example, $100 of shares in the movie theater. He used $100 million, but most of us can come up with maybe we could buy $100. But then by the year end, those shares are not worth $100. They're worth $30. So that's a $70 loss. And so now you have to write that off in terms of future tax bills. Now, using his numbers, if it was $100 million, went down to $30 million, you have a $70 million loss. But this is the catcher in the bill. It would only be paid out in increments of $3,000, which means it would take 200 lifetimes to actually realize the deduction, the way this thing is written. So basically, you'd use the money, but you wouldn't get your money back. As a matter of fact, you would really get hurt pretty badly. He says now, assuming that you have somebody that bought it at $30 million and now it's grown to $540 million, well, then it talks about how much you would owe in terms of the proposal, how this would affect the net gain. And he just begins to show all of the disasters there because let's face it, if you're talking about investing in stock, it goes all over the map. A lot of it's fairly volatile. Right now, a lot of people say, well, Bitcoin is really volatile. Oh, nothing like Amazon. I looked this up the other day. Do you realize that of the people that invested in Amazon stock, only four people still hold that stock? That'd be Jeff Bezos, his two parents, and his former wife. Everybody else, at one time or another, bailed out of Amazon stock because I think once it dropped like 90%. So again, if you're actually going to be taxing this whole idea of an unrealized capital gains, do you get a refund if indeed the stock drops or your investment drops or the house that you actually paid unrealized capital gains now drops because we have a housing shortage or all sorts of other disasters taking place? And you can see that this is a disaster waiting to happen. But it's one more reason why, if you haven't contacted your member of Congress, that Take Action item, Build Back Better Act, we give you lots of other good arguments. But today, more and more people are talking about this capital gains tax grab, what a disaster it is, and what it would mean to you and your family. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we've talked about a few things having to do with taxes, and I'd love to get your thoughts about that. But one question I want to put on the table, because we're going to talk about this idea of supply chain and also the issue of strikes that might be taking place. And so I'd love to know if you've noticed any kind of shortages in your area of the country. Since we broadcast all over the country, some of you may have noticed shortages in, for example, a grocery store or in a big box store, hardware store, whatever. Love to know about that because maybe you can give us some perspective. And the next thing I want to talk about is that if you think we have a problem with empty shelves right now, it could get worse. Now, I always like to try to give you positives, and yet at the same time, I think I'd be remiss if I weren't to report some things that you could do something about right now. I was in a meeting yesterday where somebody said, and his argument was, he's not an economist, but again, he said, over the next 16 weeks, we're probably going to have maybe some shortages. So you might want to consider what you do and stock up on some food or water, whatever you might want to do. And I thought that was reasonable because he's a Christian who was talking about just having discernment. You can see in the Old Testament, what did Joseph say? Well, when we have a time of plenty, maybe we should stock up for times of famine. And we don't necessarily predict that kind of cataclysm, but we do suspect that there might be an issue. And so the next time you go to the grocery store, why don't you buy 2 cans instead of 1? Why don't you buy a few other non-perishable kinds of items? Then you got them. And if you don't need them, well, then you're just stocked up and you buy less the next time. But if you are going to pay attention, what we're going to talk about here, Stephen Moore, who's been on the program with us before, an economist. He's been with the Wall Street Journal. Of course, he has also written for National Review and also with Freedom Works and all of the rest, is saying that if you think the supply chain problems, empty shelves in stores, and higher inflation are problems now, wait a few weeks. They are likely to get worse. So why does he say that? He says that it isn't a result of hurricanes, a pandemic, or other acts of nature. It is due, and he's, of course, been a Trump supporter, so he blames the incompetence at the Oval Office. Well, you can agree or disagree with that. But he says when you look at this, there is one prominent reason the short supply of goods of fruits and vegetables to gasoline to toys for Christmas will go from a headache to a crisis, because he says we're now witnessing the end of 4 decades of labor peace in America. That is 2 prominent companies, Kellogg's and John Deere. And I've been in the town of both of them, gone through the tour of the John Deere museum. Fascinating, by the way. We're all pro John Deere around our family. But anyway, they're now facing strikes with thousands of workers walking off the job. First of all, the United Auto Workers strike against John Deere is the first major labor unrest at this Illinois plant since the mid-1980s. Last time Kellogg's, that's up in Battle Creek, Michigan, I've been there as well, had a work stoppages in 1972. So we're talking about 2. Now, again, he's using Kellogg's. That's your cereal. John Deere, well, that's a lot of things, everything from harvesters to even the lawnmowers sometimes you will use. And so we have strikes on the horizon that we haven't had since the 1970s or 1980s. You with me on that? It gets worse because we already have nearly 11 million unfilled jobs due, he argues, to super generous welfare benefits. And so as a result, we have, as we talked about the other day, a shortage of dock workers, truckers, and factory workers, which is inciting higher inflation due to shortages. And now if thousands of more workers in these critical industries go on strike, he thinks this could be quite a disaster. So, again, we've talked about each element a perfect storm, because we've had individuals that were getting paid not to work. And I've said, if you pay people not to work, what happens? Well, they don't work. Or now that we don't provide those welfare benefits in some of the states any longer, we do in some, don't in others, so it depends on which state you're living in right now, where you pay people not to work, then they get used to not working, even though they're not getting the benefits. Do you see what I'm saying? So it almost doesn't matter whether they're getting benefits or not. The benefits are certainly an inhibitor, but the fact is that we have so many jobs that could be filled that are not being filled. And as I pointed out just the other day, you might look right now at those container ships in Los Angeles and Long Beach out there waiting to be unloaded. But even if they're unloaded, there are not enough people to unload them all, of course, but there are also not enough trucks to take all the goods and resources away. So there is where we are. So given the circumstances that we have right now, Stephen Moore, who probably isn't, necessarily a pro-union guy, but let's listen to what he has to say. He says the worker shortages only give more leverage to the unions to walk off the job for higher pay and benefits. Now, on the one hand, I don't blame people for wanting higher pay, because one of the problems, we talked about this on Monday with Victor Davis Hanson, is when inflation goes up, wages never go up. I mean, if you just assume right now that the consumer price index is accurate, and they say it's 5.4%. I don't believe it. I think the inflation rate is closer to 10%, but let's just use their numbers. Let's just say the inflation rate is 5%. Let me ask you a question. Did your wages go up 5% in the last couple of months? Probably not. Will it go up 5% by the end of the year? Probably not. So you can begin to understand why there are people that are saying, wait a minute, the price of the goods that we are manufacturing, whether it's John Deere tractors or basically Kellogg's cereal, those prices are going up, but my wages aren't going up. So I'm not necessarily flawing the unions for wanting to deal with this issue. And again, let's be fair. The last time you had a work stoppage by Kellogg's in Battle Creek was in 1972. I'm sure that a good number of you listening right now were not even born in 1972. That's how long it's been. And then you have John Deere. The last time they had any kind of issue was kind of in the mid-1980s when Ronald Reagan was the president. Again, just think this through. So now John Deere workers balked at a proposed 5% raise. You might say, well, that's generous. Well, no, it's not really, but that's part of it. Inflation was closer to 6 or 7%. And of course, if you hadn't had a raise in a while, that 5% really then, if it's amortized, is like 2%. You can see why they did that. So anyway, Stephen Moore goes on to say, here's the vicious cycle we could be looking in due time. Inflation means higher prices at the stores, which means workers want higher pay, which means inflation, companies have higher costs, which means the firms have to raise their prices further, and the process repeats and again and again and again and again. 6% inflation could snowball into 8% to 10% by the end of the year, and he's using the numbers that everybody uses, and I'm just sure that those are actually much lower than reality. So we begin to recognize what that could mean. Let's finish off here before we take some phone calls. By the way, if you'd like to join us, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you noticing prices going up in the stores? Are you noticing trying to buy lumber that's more expensive? Are you noticing this in terms of trying to buy a used car? Let me know what you're thinking. But also, have you seen some shortages? We want to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. But he also goes on to say that as price volatility gets moderated, and it was under Ronald Reagan, so did strikes, because back then, of course, we had the dollar was as good as gold, but it's not now. It's getting printed at record numbers, and so that's an issue. And so he says, it reminds me a little bit of the movie Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox, because now we have a situation that reminds us of the earlier periods that some of us that are older remember, and that is where you have rising prices, a slowdown in the economy, and as he said, the worst of all worlds. And so that's kind of the issue. And then, of course, you have these bottlenecks that are created by a variety of things. Lack of workers, strikes. That now squeezes the supply chain, which was really kind of the hallmark, he says, of American economic efficiency. And so as a result, we're seeing the possibility that as bad as the supply chain problem is right now, it could actually get worse by looking at the fact that if indeed you have strikes, which look like they're basically going to happen at Kellogg's and John Deere, what does that mean to the cereal you can buy or the other kinds of baked goods that may be available, or the equipment either for John Deere or others that are actually providing the services to John Deere? And you can begin to see that the best way, he says, for Washington to ensure long-term worker gains is to get inflation as well as this so-called wage tax under control. And yet I see absolutely no interest that this president wants to do that anytime soon. So let's open up the phones, give you a chance to join the conversation today. What have you seen in the stores where you have been? Do you see any shortages? Do you see prices going up? And are you going to make any kind of plans to maybe buy an extra canned good or two and set it aside just to have it on the shelf and be ready for the future? I'd love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Got a number of calls, which I'll get to in just a second. Let me just mention that my commentary today is about voter fraud prosecutions, and I'm going to talk about that in the second hour. And as a program note, let me just mention tomorrow in the second hour, I'm going to have Don Huffines. In the first hour, by the way, we have Max McLean. We're going to be talking about this new C.S. Lewis film. Do really encourage you to go to that, Reluctant Convert. But in the second hour, Don Don Huffines actually is running against Governor Greg Abbott for the governorship in Texas. But interestingly enough, Don Huffines, when he was a state senator, broke the story years ago about all the people just in Dallas County that were voting illegally. Some of them were voting illegally and didn't know that they were not allowed to vote when they were not citizens, and some were doing it for decades sometimes. One of them goes all the way back to 1980, been voting illegally in all sorts of elections. And so he broke the story there, and I thought it'd be good to talk to him about that. Of course, he's going to have some things to say about why he's running for governor, but I just wanted to let you know, those of you that are kind of concerned about this issue of voter fraud, or why aren't they prosecuting these individuals? Well, we'll talk about that next hour. It's one of my commentaries today. But at the moment, wanted to talk about supply chain. So let's, if we can, go to Arizona. KNLB, Martha, tell us your story.
So our shelves never got full after COVID, and you'll notice that things are missing, like, salsa and pasta and rice. And so what my daughter did was she ordered a 40-pound bag of rice online, and UPS delivered a box that had been opened and retaped, and there was nothing in it.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And people are starting to order from Amazon and things like that, saying, in my particular community, and again, I recognize that we have a very diverse audience. I've gone out and met a lot of you out there, and some of you live fairly close to, or either in a city or a town or very close to it, and some of you live way out. And so sometimes the people that say, well, we got everything stocked on our shelf, you're going, well, yeah, but I'm gathering from you, you're a little more in the rural area, and you're saying, no, our shelves never really did fill up, and here it's possibly going to go from bad to worse. Now, I'm not trying to bring bad news. I'm trying to give you some encouragement to do what you can now, so that if 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now we see some things looking really dire, you are one of those people that is planned for the future. And so that's really why I'm covering this today. And I'm not trying to be a bearer of bad news, but when Stephen Moore talks about some of these strikes, it's like, I hadn't even thought about that. Oh boy, we really are in a difficult season, and so let's see what we can do as Americans to pull up ourselves from our bootstraps and do what we can to make a difference. So, Martha, thank you for sharing that, and I'm going to try to go through as many calls as I can, and if I don't get to you this hour, we'll carry you over to the next hour. I wanted to head out to, I think it's Peoria, Illinois. Alan, I'd love to have you share your story.
Yeah, well, I'm a senior citizen. I was a truck driver for years. I retired. And my pension's not going up, hasn't gone up a dime from the time that I retired.
There you go.
To now, and that was at the end of 1999. What's it going to do to your senior citizens? All this. And
yeah, and go ahead. I want you to talk about what it's affecting you, because each year you see the prices going up, and the consumer price index goes up, but I think it's actually defective because they don't count the same basket of goods they did in the 1980s, because you're probably almost as old as I am, or older, I don't know. But the bottom line is, now they're telling us it's 5%, but even at 5%, and we don't increase your pension, we don't provide any extra benefits usually for Medicare, Medicaid, things like that, other than cost of living, which is tied into CPI, and it just gets harder and harder to just make ends meet, doesn't it?
yes, and when you're talking about this increase of taxes on wealth, all right, so I've owned my house for a lot of years. Then they come along and say, well, your taxes if we're going to tax you on the capital gains on your house, don't you think that's going to really put a lot of senior citizens under, because they worked for a lot of years to pay off their houses and things before this happened?
And again, they're going to say right now, well, we're not going to tax you. We're just going to tax the uber rich. But I know where it goes eventually. And just the other issue that if you just even think about property taxes, and I don't know Illinois as well as I know California and Texas and places where I've lived before, but oftentimes when the house prices go up, then the appreciation for those goes up. And so this is a way that the local county commissioners don't even have to increase taxes, because as long as the house prices are going up, they can can keep the same rate and they still bring in more money. And so there's a deal there that needs to be addressed as well. So, Alan, first of all, thank you for your service as a truck driver, and I think you're illustrating exactly why I felt that this was something we should talk about. But let's head out to California for just a minute. Leroy, thank you for joining us today. I think you have another story to share with us.
Yes, I do. As we all know, that gas prices are going up, and everything else as well is going up. But oh my gosh, I went to a McDonald's and to purchase a hash brown, which was at one point you could get it for like $1, and sometimes they have it like for $2 for $1. But now, I actually went to a McDonald's last week to get a hash brown, which was $1. Now those things are $2.60. You talk about prices going up on stuff.
Well,
I mean,
again,
come on.
I was afraid you're going to tell me that the hash brown was the size of a postage stamp, because that's the other part I've seen. And again, we've been saying some nice things about Kellogg's, but if you've been looking at Kellogg's or any of these others, I actually got a candy bar the other day. I've kept it in my drawer for the longest time because I try not to eat too many candy bars, but I needed something to keep me going. And I'm thinking, candy bar is not the size of the candy bar I had when I was a kid. And so they're smaller and smaller. So either you're paying more and more or you're getting less and less, but that's the way they cover that. But just before we take a break, and we will take some more calls next hour, I wanted to go to our caller in Arizona, Shamar, talking about how this could be a real great opportunity for Christians to share their faith. Shamar, thank you for calling today.
Yes, you talked about getting an extra can of food at the grocery store. You instead of getting one, just get two, or get a bag of dry beans, and it's very easy to dry can them up, and then you can give dry beans to a family that's starving and that doesn't know Jesus, and you can use the opportunity to share about Jesus. So if you have enough for yourself and some extra for other people, and it'd be an awesome opportunity.
I think it's a great opportunity. And I've said that before, and I was going to say that, and then I just thought I'd let you say it because I was going to mention that, because if indeed you want to prepare for the future, wouldn't it be something that in a community where everybody's saying, boy, I can't find this and I can't find that, and somebody says, well, I heard this Christian radio show and they were talking about maybe we should just get some extra supplies, and I've got some extras, let me just give it to you. And they say, oh, no, I'll pay for it. No, that's certainly, I want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. I want to thank you for being in the neighborhood, and what can I do to minister to you? There would be some great opportunities always in that case. And wouldn't it be amazing if in every community the people who were out of debt and were well financed and very stable and certainly had resources they were willing to share with their neighbors, if all those were Christians? I mean, what a great Christian testimony that might be. So I think that is a good argument there as well. But we can still take some more phone calls if you want on the issue of supply chain, but I've got some other issues here, one of which we'll talk about the voter fraud prosecutions. I also have some question about whether we should capitulate to China. Very good piece that came from Michael Brown. And some of the parents that have been called domestic terrorists, they're really pushing back against the Attorney General. So we've got a lot more to cover in this next hour. So let's take a break. When we come back, though, if you want to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you want to let your member of Congress know what you think about the Build Back Better Act and some of the things we talked about this hour, go to our website, click on that button that says Take Action, and we'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As I announced before we went to the break, we will at least just mention the fact that my commentary today is about voter fraud prosecutions. And one of the things I've noticed as I've traveled around, I'm getting questions like, well, why isn't the government prosecuting voter fraud? My quick answer is that if you look at state and local governments, they oftentimes are, but it isn't necessarily reported. Now, you might say, well, why isn't it reported? Well, news outlets may not think it's an important story. After all, in some cases, it's just one individual or in some cases a cabal of individuals that were engaged in that. It's maybe a good state and local story, but sometimes not even there. I think there's also a fear on the part of the various news outlets that fear that if you report some of these prosecutions, people might have questions about the security of our vote. And that sounds like it's too pro-Trump, so we're not going to do that. So that's the problem, though. I've said by not reporting these investigations into voter fraud, it makes it easier for critics of voter integrity laws to maintain that these are legislative revisions which are trying to find a solution for a non-existent problem. Now, I think we've made some headway, because ever since John Funn wrote his first book back in 2000, I think it was when that first came out, on voter fraud, he wrote it in part because you had such a close presidential election. He then had, of course, seen so much more. And then John Funn and Hans von Spakovsky have written about this. Of course, Heritage Foundation has a database that goes into all sorts of examples of that. But I thought just for a minute I would mention these three articles that dropped into my inbox just in 1 week. But before I do that, we were, as I said before, probably should keep the microphone on during the breaks. We were talking about Dan Patrick, who's the lieutenant governor here in the state of Texas. And he actually offered very sizable rewards to individuals who could actually document voter fraud, and just paid out apparently $25,000 to an individual in Pennsylvania that documented that a Republican tried to vote twice. So sometimes voter fraud is Republican. More often it's Democrat, but I don't care what particular political designation you have, it is wrong. And here are just a few examples that I used in my column. And these just all came in 1 week. I didn't even look for I wasn't out looking for them. They just dropped into my box. One in Michigan. We have listeners in Michigan, for example. 3 women were charged with crimes related to voter fraud. One of the women, for example, stole a stack of absentee voter applications which were meant for nursing home residents, filled them out, forged the residents' signatures. She's being prosecuted, so there's one example. In Georgia, well, we know a lot about Georgia, but the one I use there is simply the 2 workers in Fulton County lost their jobs because of these accusations of voter fraud. And again, I'm clear to say accusations, but every one of these is so clear we know that there will be an actual conviction, probably. And if you look at the database that I've made available before on our website, you can see that those, in most cases, are indeed convictions. And then let's do Pennsylvania. This one is in Philadelphia, but it actually goes back before the 2020 election in terms of a voter fraud scheme, which is pretty incredible. I mean, it goes on for quite a number of years in which there were cash payments that were helping family, friends, allies, and those kinds of things. But I thought, as you read into that article, and it went on for a couple of pages, one of the things that jumped out to me was this. Even of greater importance was the statement by prosecutors that fraud occurred at every level of government, from municipal to state to federal. Now, each one of these articles, or any ones that are reported by the mainstream press or the establishment press, almost all have a disclaimer that says finding fraud does not prove that there was widespread voter fraud. In each one of these cases, don't think it probably affected the presidential election unless there were many other Confederates that were doing the same. But that's not the point. Most people that have ever been looking into voter fraud don't allege that it's always widespread, but they do believe that targeted voter fraud sometimes occurs in certain cities and certain precincts. And the goal should always be make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And I'm always just a little bit offended by people that are saying by requiring, for example, a photo ID, we're making it hard to vote. No, we're not. And because if you don't even have a photo ID, you can provide other ways to prove that you are the individual voting, then that should be reason enough. And we know that in almost every precinct that I'm aware of, and I've worked as a precinct chairman, and I've had friends that have been poll watchers and things like that, that if you actually do have a question about an individual, then they oftentimes will let them actually fill out what's called a provisional ballot. And then if indeed there was a close election, they'll go back and look at that and verify whether or not that individual should be considered one of the legal votes. And so this is not something where people are being stopped at the precinct or stopped at the voting place and not allowed to vote. There's just an attempt to make sure that we know that cheating has existed for some time, and that is something that we need to try to eliminate. And of course, the examples I just gave you a minute ago, when you are actually sending out all of these absentee voter lists and voter applications, and then an individual can then take them in a nursing home and fill them all out and forge their signatures, and then only then does that individual get caught, do you see the possible difficulty there. So again, let's make it as easy as possible to vote, but let's make it as hard as possible to cheat, and that's kind of my argument for that. When we take a break, I'll come back from the break. I do want to cover a couple of issues. First of all, very good piece by Michael Brown. It's been on the program before. Dr. Brown talks about how it is amazing to him how you can hardly say anything negative about China. So that's our third article there, and we'll focus some time and attention on that. And since it looks like we have a little more time today, also do want to talk about how there has been a pushback from, first of all, parents to the National School Board Association, which has now apologized for sending that letter to President Biden and to the Attorney General Merrick Garland. But at the same time, doesn't look to me like the Attorney General is going to back down on that issue. So we're going to see where that takes us. And so we'll focus on that. And then might get into a couple more economic issues, because Ben Shapiro also has a few comments about for example, the trying to tax unrealized capital gains and actually investigating into your bank account. And John Stossel has a good piece on lessons from Venezuela. So there's a lot more to cover, but if we have covered an issue you would like to make a comment about, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read the piece that I've written on voter fraud prosecution, that's on the website at pointofview.net. I just picked out 3 examples that landed in my inbox in 1 week, and that's just a very small representation of other prosecutions that I know are taking place. And as I mentioned, Don Huffines will be with us tomorrow. When he was state senator, he was able to expose a number of people in the Dallas County, which is hardly a hotbed for voter fraud, who've been voting illegally for sometimes decades. So we'll talk about that with him tomorrow. Let's take a break. We'll talk about China right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One question I'm frequently asked is, why isn't the government prosecuting voter fraud? My quick answer is that the state and local governments are charging people with voter fraud, but often the media isn't reporting it. News outlets may not think it's an important story, or they may fear that reporting the prosecutions would stimulate more questions about the security of our vote. Not reporting investigations into voter fraud make it easier for critics of voter integrity laws to maintain that these legislative revisions are merely trying to find a solution for a non-existent problem. Just in the last week, I had 3 different articles land in my inbox that demonstrate that election fraud prosecution is taking place right now. In Michigan, 3 women were charged with crimes related to voter fraud. One woman, for example, stole a stack of absentee voter applications meant for nursing home residents, filled them out, and forged the residents' signatures. In Georgia, 2 workers in Fulton County lost their jobs due to accusations of voter fraud, which led to a public statement from the Georgia Secretary of State about such embarrassing revelations. A former judge of elections was charged in the voter fraud scheme in Philadelphia from 2015 to 2019. This included cash payments, along with supporting family, friends, and allies for elective office. Even of greater importance was the statement by prosecutors that fraud occurred at every level of government, from municipal to state to federal. Most of these stories always carry the disclaimer that finding fraud does not prove that there was widespread voter fraud. But that isn't the point. The problem isn't widespread fraud, but targeted voter fraud that can occur in certain cities and precincts. We need laws that make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we talked about everything from the capital gains tax grab to whether America's going to go on strike, the supply chain, the issue of voter fraud. But I wanted to, if we could, focus just a little bit of time and attention on China, because we unfortunately are not being well served by the press, even by many politicians, in terms of the fact that China is certainly destined, if they think their plans will come to fruition, destined to be the dominant superpower in the middle part of the 21st century. And that should concern you because, after all, China up until now has at least been a trading partner, and now they aren't necessarily buying our treasuries and our bonds, and they are rattling their sabers at Taiwan. And, of course, the October issue of Outlook is on China. We go into that in some detail. So when I came across this piece, which is our 3rd article for you to read, and I would certainly recommend it, is We Must Not Capitulate to China. Now, it's written by Dr. Michael Brown. Now, if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we usually have him on to talk about oftentimes like domestic policy issues. He's been quite an expert, of course, on the issue of sexual orientation, homosexuality, and those kinds of things. Might also mention that he is certainly very gifted as a former Jewish individual who's become a Christian in terms of evangelism of Jews and things of that nature. So he really brings a lot of expertise to his conversations with us. But don't really read too much about China. But he starts by saying, what are the real intentions of China's President Xi Jinping? Well, how nefarious are his plans? And how should the West respond? He said, when I asked these questions to a colleague who has lived and worked in China for almost all his adult life, someone fully absorbed in the culture and well educated in Chinese thought, he replied bluntly, China wants to dominate the world. I think that's a true statement, and it's one that if you say that sometimes even on Facebook or Twitter, it can get you in trouble, but I think it is a true statement, and it's easy to discern in terms of the desire of what Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese Communist Party are trying to bring about. His friend went on to explain China wants to dominate the world's economy and have the ability to cripple the economy of the rest of the world. And my colleague commented, it is very possible that China could succeed. That's why, then, of course, Dr. Michael Brown says, all the more reason, then, that we should refuse to capitulate to China, not ideologically and not economically. Unfortunately, he says, it appears that for some time now we've been doing the exact opposite. So he gives us 5 different examples, and I'll try to cover each one of those. But again, if you would like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. First example he has to do is with Apple. He says, earlier this month, Business Insider reported that Apple has taken down a Quran app and a Bible app in China at the request of Chinese officials. This was confirmed by the BBC. And then why, pray tell, did Apple do this? Michael Brown asked. Well, Apple directed the BBC to its human rights policy, which says we're required to comply with local laws, and at times there are complex issues about which we may disagree with governments and other stakeholders on the right path forward. Apple told the BBC that Chinese officials had said the apps breached laws on hosting illegal religious texts. Okay, one of the texts is the Quran. It's a Muslim text, obviously. The other text is the Bible, okay? And those are illegal religious texts. And Apple, instead of saying, no, I mean, the app's up there. I mean, people can decide to get it or not to get it. Nope, they took it down so that nobody in China would have access to a Bible app on their phone. You with me on that? Put another way, as Michael Brown puts it, we dare not rock the boat and get China upset. We make far too much money in China and depend way too much on China for us to take a stand for human rights and religious liberties. Instead, in the name of human rights, we will sell out countless millions of Chinese Christians and Chinese Muslims. And then he has a whole section there if you want to get more on some of the other censorship that has taken place. But his first example is Apple. His second one, interestingly enough, is the wrestler and superstar John Cena. If you're not familiar with that, he says that back in May when the wrestling and acting superstar John Cena issued an apology to China in Chinese for his grievous sin of referring to Taiwan as a country. How treasonable, he says. Anyway, but with a new flick coming out by him, about to be released to the massive viewing audience in China, how could he not apologize? Too much money was at stake. There's more we could talk about that, but I'm going to keep the train moving down the road, and now we'll get to the third one. This one we've talked about before, but it's worth mentioning again since we're in the midst of the NBA season. We just had opening night for the Dallas Mavericks last night, and they won, by the way. But again, you probably don't care, but it was fascinating to watch that game play out. And this one has to do with the NBA, and that has to do with a man by the name of Daryl Morey, general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team. And this goes back actually 2 years, but nevertheless, that's when he tweeted out his support, in this case, not for Taiwan, his support for what? The Hong Kong protesters. And of course, as we have already documented, and as Michael Brown talks about in his piece, the backlash was immediate and severe. Chinese businesses severed their ties. The Chinese Basketball Association said it would suspend all cooperation with this Texas-based team, the Houston Rockets. And in an official statement, China's consulate general in Houston also urged the team to clarify and immediately correct the mistakes. And the NBA's very relationship with China was endangered. But fear not, Daryl Morey quickly issued an apology saying, "I did not intend my tweet to cause any offense to Rocket fans and friends of mine in China, was merely voicing one thought based on one interpretation of one complicated event. I've had a lot of opportunities since that tweet to hear and consider other perspectives. I've always appreciated the significant support our Chinese fans and sponsors have provided. I would hope that those who are upset will know that offending or misunderstanding them was not my intention. My tweets are my own and in no way represent the Rockets or the NBA." 1 year later, by the way, if you haven't kept track, Daryl Morey resigned from his position in Houston, moving on to work with another NBA team. And as he says, how interesting. While we're talking NBA, let's talk about LeBron James. As for LeBron James, one of the NBA's greatest and most influential players of all time. Again, that's a comment by Marco Brown. He's never been afraid to speak out against racial inequality in America. In the situation in Hong Kong, though, that was different. He said, "I don't want to get into a verbal feud with Daryl Morey, but I believe he wasn't educated on the situation at hand, and he spoke, and so many people could have been harmed not only financially, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So just be careful what we tweet and say and we can do, even though, yes, we do have freedom of speech, but there's a lot of negative that comes from that." So there you go. I will take some more, but let me also take a phone call because as we talk about China, I suspect some of you would like to join the conversation because I haven't finished my entire list, but that has already generated a phone call. So let's go to Georgia. First of all, WLPE, Marcella, thank you for calling today.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, me too. It's a good day. It's beautiful outside. Question: I'm in the 60s, and as a kid, I used to always hear about things being made in Japan.
And Japan still, Japan certainly makes those. Now more and more of them made in China, and there's a reason for that, because workers in Japan have to get paid fair wages. And various workers in Japan maybe don't have OSHA regulations like we do here, but they have significant regulations in terms of the environment, worker health, and the rest. And so as a result, it is just much cheaper to get various things manufactured in China than it was in Japan. And so that's the sad reality, because, you know, we used to talk about made in Japan. Sometimes they weren't the best. That sometimes was not only a comment, but sometimes even a disclaimer. But the reason a lot of those various parts that are manufactured or assembled are no longer manufactured or assembled in Japan is because China is not actually putting its workers under the same kind of protection, pay, and other kinds of safety and environmental regimes. And so that's why some of that took place. Probably deserve a longer answer, but I'm coming to a break. When we come back, let me finish off here with China. Just wanted you to see this as another article and maybe an illustration for why anytime somebody says something about China, there are people running to the high grass very quickly, other people running to try to apologize for that, and why you rarely, especially when an institution, whether it's a media outlet or it's an athletic group or whether it's movies or others, they want to go out of their way not to say anything critical about China. And of course, we love the Chinese people. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. I have to issue that disclaimer every single time. But anyway, let's come back. We'll take some more phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that is 1-800-351-1212. Some of you want to ask some economic questions. Some of you want to talk about this issue of China. As a matter of fact, the next piece I was going to read from Michael Brown talked about somebody who really has spoken out. But I just noticed that Ike in Arizona, listening on KNLB, wants to tell us the story of this player that plays for the Boston Celtics. So, Ike, tell us more.
Yes, Kerby. Live in Arizona, but I get tweets from Senator Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, and he retweeted one from a Boston Celtics player that really called out Nike, and he used the word hypocrisy for using, I think it's pronounced Uyghur, the Uyghur people, their slave labor to make the Nike shoes and all that.
The Muslim Uyghurs is how they pronounce it. And he is a Muslim, by the way. His name is Enes Kanter, and he's a Turkish Muslim. But yes, and go ahead.
Yeah, and anyway, he, of course, as a born-again Christian, he has some views of supporting some agendas of the left, the homosexual agenda and stuff like that. But he also is friends with the Jewish ambassador to the United Nations, and is he fights against anti-Semitism. So anyway, it's just, in my mind, very refreshing to have an NBA player that said, I would like to invite the CEO of Nike Shoes. China will let us in. We would travel and see how the shoes are made. And I'd like to invite Michael Jordan and LeBron James if they'd like to come. Anyway.
Good piece. Okay, I kind of lost you there, but I think we got the point. And that was actually the next one I was going to mention. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to get that as well, because you've been talking about some people that have been willing to capitulate. But this article by Michael Brown then goes into the story. So let me finish it off by talking about the fact that you do have this individual, Enes Kanter. He's a Turkish Muslim, and he plays now for the Boston Celtics. And he spoke out against Chinese control of Tibet, for example, talked about the Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs. And of course, you just heard Ike talk a little bit about the whole issue of Nike. And so when, again, he spoke out in that regard, you thought, okay, well, they're going to put some pressure on him and he's going to have to issue an apology. No way, because he tweeted on Sunday. This is amazing. This is going to go on for some time. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, someone has to teach you a lesson. I will never apologize for speaking the truth. You cannot buy me. You cannot scare me. You cannot silence me. Bring it on. And then he's got hashtag freedom shoes. He also has Zinni the Pooh, which is the idea of Xeni. Anyway, that's kind of a turn of phrase. But again, he has Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Someone has to teach you a lesson. I will never apologize, on and on and on. You will not silence me. And by the way, this is costing the NBA some money because the Chinese TV stations are refusing to air certain games, the games in which the, say, Boston Celtics play with another team. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out in the next few days and weeks. Will the NBA find a way to force Kanter to back down, or is there any way he will back down? And so again, Michael Brown saying, I'm not a fan of calling the leader of China names, but nevertheless, he says, I commend him for standing his ground. And as Ike just shared a minute ago, that's the case. One last one, and then we'll move on because I got some other phone calls. It's also been reported this week that China is pressuring the Vatican to sever its ties with Taiwan. As I've predicted before, I could be wrong, but I doubt it. China may not move on Taiwan until after the Olympics in China, but I would say that if I were guessing, the Chinese military will go into Taiwan after that. And so it's interesting right now that there is pressure being brought on the Vatican to sever its ties with Taiwan. And so the question is, well, will the Vatican, will the Catholic Church do this? What about the relationship of the Chinese Catholic Church What's the Pope going to do? Will be interesting. So the point he makes is that there's no sense in putting money before morals, and I think it is just a very good piece that we have posted on our website. And again, kudos to Michael Brown, Dr. Michael Brown. We've always enjoyed him on the program, and I appreciate him taking some time to write about the fact that we should not capitulate with China. And if you'd like to learn more about what's going on with China, Taiwan, and a variety of other things, that is the October issue of Outlook. If you're a donor, you should already have received it. Matter of fact, you should now be receiving the November one, which is dealing with social media. But nevertheless, if you would like to get a copy, I'm sure we could send one to you if you want to contact us. Let's go back to the phones, though. We have some more phone calls. We'll go to South Carolina. Don, I think you've got a very good question on the table here.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask if there's any data or your opinion on how folks are making it after the rental moratorium has lifted and the extra emergency unemployment has stopped. How are they making their bills and without going back to work?
And again, I think you've asked a very good question, and I wrote a little bit about that. So for those of you that would like to see the facts, they may come pretty fast here, but my October 11th commentary, so you can go to pointofview.net, do a search, or just scroll down to that one. I'd entitled it Hardly Working. And first of all, it gives you some numbers about what happened before and then after the $300 weekly federal unemployment issue. And that's where there was a big question, because a lot of people thought, well, then you're going to see probably an uptick in the number of people who up until now maybe weren't looking for work. As I've suggested in one of the booklets I make available to our donors, A Biblical View of Work, I think you've had kind of a decline of the Christian worldview, and thus you've had a decline of what oftentimes was referred to as the Protestant work ethic, and really the Christian work ethic, because they saw it in Protestant countries, but you also saw them in Catholic countries too. And so I gave you one very interesting piece of information that generated some response. Some people said, oh, I want to see the original report. So I took the time to send it out. But it was a study done by an economist at the University of Chicago. And they were recognizing that even if you don't receive the $300 weekly federal unemployment insurance bonus, you still receive all sorts of other issues, and pointed out, interestingly enough, that when you look at some of these high welfare benefit states, and I only mentioned New York and Connecticut, but really there was nearly a dozen that could fit into this category. If you took a family of four in one of these high welfare benefit states with two unemployed parents, they could receive up to $100,000 in government assistance. Now, what I mean by that is that they didn't necessarily always receive money, but you would have to make that level. You'd have to make a six-figure income to equal that, because you would have to make that much, then pay the taxes to receive that many benefits. Now, I recognize that's an extreme example. Don, living in South Carolina, says, well, that's not what's happening in South Carolina. No, it's not happening in Mississippi, not happening in Alabama. It's not happening in a lot of places, but it is happening in a lot of these states where it actually almost makes more sense to not work than it does to work. And I've said before, it isn't necessarily always that people are lazy, although I admit that people are lazy, and some people take advantage and game the system. It is that people are also sometimes making rational decisions. If I can make as much by staying home and avoiding the possibility of getting COVID, and I can stay at home and not have the wear and tear of driving to work or trying to catch the right buses to work or trying to deal with trying to get daycare for my kids or whatever all that is, I'm going to stay home. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in that position is going to receive the same benefits, but I am saying that the number that I used in that column, which caused some people to say, now, are you sure about that? I went back and I guess I could send it to anybody, but that would keep me busy all day, of all the original studies, which were pretty striking, because we do provide some incredible benefits for unemployed individuals. And the impetus that used to exist for people to go out and get work have been pretty much eviscerated. You might remember, those of you a little bit older, during the 1990s, at that time you had Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, you had Bill Clinton as president, you had kind of the individual thinking through some of these issues. Marvin Olasky, who is at World Magazine now, but he was at one point a professor, University of Texas, writing The Tragedy of American Compassion, arguing for a work requirement for people receiving welfare. Those have been pretty much removed, but there is still nevertheless a significant number of benefits that go to individuals that aren't working. And so even though, as Don points out, they're not receiving that additional $300 bonus, still some pretty significant choices people have to make about going to work or staying home. Anyway, we'll take a break, and we'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia. Brick, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Yes, well, I was listening to the program, Kerby, this Point of View, and I heard you mention China's aggression towards Taiwan, and I understand that there was a chance that if China moves against Taiwan militarily, and if there's an attack on Taiwan, would that be the same as an attack on America, or an attack on our forces in the Pacific, or an attack on our allies and how would we respond to that?
Very good question. First of all, it takes us back to the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which basically would trigger a response from us. Now, would it be the same as an attack on us? I think it's written in such a way to not necessarily say that. But if you were to ask any president other than the current president, certainly they would have said, no, we are going to defend Taiwan, and we have invested a lot of money and resources in Taiwan for very good reasons. Number one, we believe that it's a free area. It's oftentimes referred to as the heart of Asia. It's the home for 24 million people. It is one of the wealthier countries in the region for sure. And of course, it has such a strategic situation because we are in many ways dependent upon aircraft carriers, but we don't have to always have aircraft carriers. We can have various U.S. Military deployed on Taiwan. So there's some real benefits to that. And I think everybody other than the current president have always said we would honor the Taiwan Relations Act. But the sort of ambiguity that we're getting right now from the Secretary of State Blinken and the president, Biden, it doesn't necessarily make the people in Taiwan feel so comfortable. And if you also see the kind of the disaster of withdrawing troops and civilians from Afghanistan, by the way, there's still lots of people in Afghanistan, even if the press isn't talking about it. That is another reasons why I think the Chinese Communist Party is saying, I think they would protest this, and they would want to even possibly have a blockade, and they might even want to have economic sanctions, but so what? We need Taiwan. We want to establish this very strategic base in our favor rather than the favor of the U.S. military. And so I'm not as convinced that we would honor the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, and that's a source of some concern. So I appreciate you bringing that up. If some of you would like to say, I need to read a little bit more about this, I might just mention that, again, since it's October, the October issue actually has a short column from me on the origin of the virus. Then I have the one on China's global ambitions, where we go into this in a lot more detail. And then in addition to that, we have the piece by Ivy Nichols, Countering China's Long Game. And then we have one by Liberty McCarter, Human Rights and Hong Kong. And so again, this is available. We sent it quite some time ago to those of you that are donors. Maybe you got it in the mail and set it aside. You might want to read it. But also, if you have said, well, I've been listening to Point of View, but I'm not a donor, but I wouldn't mind getting the issue, just let us know, and we'll see if we can get you a copy of that, because I want to speak the truth about China, as we do almost every other issue. And whether it's been Gordon Chang on this program with us, both in studio and by phone, whether it's been our good friend Gary Bauer by phone, or many others, we think this is a big issue. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to spend some time today reading what I thought was a very good piece by Dr. Michael Brown on capitulating to China. Let's take one more phone call today, and this might have to be the last one. In Georgia, Shelby, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, there's a few things. One is the generation. We've got a lack of children that are going to take care of the next generation of people, and there's not going to be enough workers in the next population. And then two, don't we want to take care of the women that have children at home, to keep them home to take care of the children? Isn't that what we should be doing, is supporting them?
Okay, good point. So first of all, the issue of the birth rate. We've had a declining birth rate in all the Western countries for some time. Now, the birth rates have dropped more precipitously in Europe than they have in the United States, but we're not at replacement value. And so as a result, the argument has always been, well, we just need to bring more people in. And so that has been the case, but of course it's changed the demographics of America, and so there's some real concerns. But you don't have to go too far in the future to figure out we got a problem, because we had a baby boom, those born between 1946 and 1964. Now more and more of them are of retirement age, and the baby boom was followed by what? A birth dearth, or a baby bust. Then you had a little bit of a baby boomlet, but you have more and more people retiring, and it's requiring more and more of the working generation to provide for those of the retiring generation. And Social Security is a great example. When Social Security was first implemented, you had 40 workers for every one recipient. By the time they expanded the benefits, still even in the 1950s, about 10 workers for every one recipient. Then it got down all the way to 3 to 1, and it's getting closer and closer every year to 2 to 1. So never has so much been required of the following generation to support the leading generation, that is those that are baby boomers. So that's a really big issue. Number two, you say, well, shouldn't we encourage mothers to stay home? Yes, we can, and that's why I think you have seen, we mentioned Marco Rubio earlier, and others that have said, let's provide tax benefits or at least reduce tax burdens on families. In other words, that right now we have, in some cases in our tax code, a marriage penalty. That is, you pay more if you're married than if you are two single individuals. We actually punish individuals, since we're talking about Social Security, that maybe you've lost a loved one, maybe a spouse, but then if you get remarried, you lose some of the benefits. So right now we have a tax code that actually is working against marriage and maybe actually encouraging cohabitation. Same thing going on with our taxes in terms of a tax code that is encouraging actually individuals to not have children. I was this last year in Hungary. They provide some incredible benefits to individuals that have children because they've come to realize that in this incredible declining birth rate, let's do what we can to actually subsidize and encourage mothers to have children, and then because they're getting those benefits, to stay home. I don't think we'll ever do anything like this in the United States, but I think it's a good illustration of a tax code that is actually going the wrong direction. We've got a lot more to cover, but we're simply out of time. Let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow we'll have Max McLean with us. We're going to be talking about this new film. If you're familiar with him, he's been doing this stage production, C.S. Lewis, A Reluctant Convert. Well, now they've produced this beautiful film. We'll actually post a trailer for you to watch. I've got the entire screener, but it will be in the theaters. And I just, again, think let's all show up when we can so that we can send a signal that we want more of these. This would be a very faith-friendly film about C.S. Lewis. Then, of course, I mentioned Don Huffines and some other individuals will be with us tomorrow. So we're going to be covering lots of important topics. In between, I'll get into a couple of other issues. I did mention John Stossel's piece on lessons from Venezuela. Good way to educate ourselves about the economic issues. Ben Shapiro's been talking about this idea of authoritarianism and punishing achievements, which relates back to one of the last action items I have for you. If you haven't taken the time to visit the Point of View website, go there today. Take action, build back better, act. Let your member of Congress know what you think about this $3.5 trillion boondoggle. Now they scaled it down to just a few $1 trillion. Oh, that's incredible. Anyway, I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer. We will see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.